The purpose of this video is to help you understand your options as it comes to doing comparison and contrast and sort of the two different main approaches you could use. And it'll give you two choices and you can kind of decide which one you think better suits you and what you want to do and your comfort level. So, as a quick review before we get into the two structures, what we're dealing with here is sort of blocks of information that use this evidence sandwich structure. So, you introduce your evidence, you give your evidence and specifics, and then you respond to it and connect it back to your purpose. So, in Essay 3, we are writing about movie scenes, and you're going to be comparing two of them to decide, which one is doing a particular thing better, more effectively. So, as one example of something you might talk about with it, it would be maybe the music, and you would talk about how the music affects the scariness of the scene, or maybe the realism of the scene, or how you feel about the characters. There's a lot of different options, but we'll just stick to scariness because that keeps it simple. So you use this structure, you introduce the element of music, you give examples of how music is used in the scene, and then you follow up by explaining how it is helping or hurting the scariness of the scene. And then when you move to the bigger picture of the essay, if you were only writing about one movie scene, your blocks of information would look like this. You'd have one about music, and then as two other examples, you could talk about acting, and you could talk about lighting. And so you would have these three blocks of information, and if it was one essay, you'd just pick the order you wanted to put them in, and you'd introduce it at the beginning, conclude at the end, and you'd be done. But now we're going to be talking about two scenes, and so now you have two sets of these blocks to deal with. So the first thing I want to point out is that you need to make sure that you are talking about the same issues with both scenes. It's not a fair comparison if you talk about music, acting, and lighting in one of them, and then you're doing like sound effects and visual effects and setting in the other one. That's not an objective comparison. You're comparing two totally different things. So first, make sure you're covering the same issues with both. And then from there, you got two main options that you can choose from as far as how you want to organize it. So the first option I'll go over is organizing by scene. And so what you do in that case is you keep your blocks together based on the scene that you're talking about. So if you're talking about, for instance, the original and remake of Night of the Living Dead, those top three would be the original one, and you talk about music, then acting, then lighting. And then the bottom three are music, acting, and lighting in the remake. And you keep the blocks of information together, so you talk all the way through about the first scene, and then in the second half of the paper, you talk all the way through about the second scene. Though I do want to point out, you want to make sure you're comparing back to the first scene as you go through the second one. You don't want to treat it like two essays squished together and no discussion between them. You want to make sure you're connecting back to what you said and actually comparing. That's where the compare and contrast thing comes from. So that's one option. The other option you could choose is to organize instead by the point of comparison. So if you do this, what you're going to do now is move the two blocks where you talk about music together, the two blocks where you talk about acting together, and the two blocks where you talk about lighting together. So now you've got more like a paragraph that's about music, a paragraph about acting, a paragraph about lighting. In each of those paragraphs, you talk about the first scene and then the second scene, and then you directly compare them to each other. Which one is using music more effectively? Which one is using acting more effectively? And so on. So if you do organizing by scene, these may be two very long paragraphs in the body, or you might have 6 shorter paragraphs. If you do the organizing by point of comparison, generally you can make a paragraph for each of these, so you'd have 3 paragraphs in the middle. And just to clarify, you can talk about a number different than 3. You could talk about 2 issues, you could talk about 4 issues. More than 4 is kind of unnecessary, so somewhere in that range of 2 to 4. I just did 3 because it fits nicely on the slides. But these are your two main options. So the advantage of doing the organizing by scene is that this is how most of us, as we start thinking about how we want to write, our brain usually organizes it by the scene. This is more natural for most people, and this is definitely fine to do. You just want to make sure that you're really intentional as you talk about that second scene, that you're referring back to the first scene as you go. That's the main challenge people encounter if they use this option. If you do the one where you organize by the point of comparison, it's a little easier to remember to do that comparing because it's kind of built into the structure. This takes a little more planning because you need to know when you start exactly what you're going to talk about, instead of with the other where you just start talking about one scene and whatever 3 things you talk about with the first one, then you do the same ones for the second one. You can also organize by scene on a first draft, and then split it up and move it around and adjust it into organizing by point of comparison in a follow-up draft. So that is also an option. So if you want to go with what feels natural up front and then adjust it so it's a little easier to stay focused on comparison, that's also something you could do. So hopefully this helps you figure out how you want to approach organizing your paper.